Matthew here. Welcome back to Dark Ascent. Today I'm covering a family who made it to the summit of Everest after years of chasing it. A father and mother who wanted this more than anything. Their son who was raised to want it too, and what it cost all three of them to get there. It was May 21st, 2016. Mount Everest, Nepal side, South Col route. 29,032 feet above sea level, the highest point on the surface of this earth. Temperatures sat around minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind had dropped to a manageable 20 miles per hour, and from the south summit you could see for miles in every direction, all the way across the Tibetan Plateau. But 200 miles to the west, a pressure system was already moving, already building, and the mountain that looked open and quiet that morning was roughly 5 hours away from becoming something else entirely. Dale Fenwick was 44 years old, from Bend, Oregon. He ran a mid-sized landscaping and irrigation company. Nothing glamorous, but he built it himself, from a 2-truck operation into a team of 30, and that told you something about who he was. Dale was the kind of man who set a target and moved toward it without a lot of noise. He had been obsessed with Everest since his early 30s, logging his progress and planning meticulously for nearly 7 years. Goals, training notes, gear breakdowns, everything documented and tracked. He kept a dedicated notebook for the climb that his family described as more detailed than most professional expedition plans. There was an entry from 2013 where he wrote about wanting to stand on the summit with his family beside him, that he wanted that specific version of it, the family version, not just the summit. That line matters more than it might seem. Lena Fenwick was 40, physical therapist, endurance runner, and she had her own relationship with the mountains that had nothing to do with Dale's ambition. She had been climbing since her mid-20s, long before she ever met him, drawn to high places in a way she described in an old trail journal I found as feeling like the only time her head went quiet. Rainier, Mont Blanc, several peaks in the Canadian Rockies. She had put in the years and the vertical and earned every camp she had ever slept in. Everest was not just Dale's dream that she had adopted. She wanted it too. She had wanted it for a long time, but she was also completely loyal to Dale's judgment on the mountain, and I think that loyalty, the way she deferred to him on the decisions that mattered, is part of what killed her. Because when the moment came where someone needed to say stop, she did not say it. She was a good enough climber to know better, and she said nothing anyway. And then there is Eli, 16 years old. He grew up with Everest photos on the walls, his father's training logs on the kitchen table, this mountain as a kind of family religion. And somewhere along the way, it became genuinely his too. He followed the seasonal dispatches, knew the routes, could name the landmarks most adults had never heard of. He wanted to climb it, but wanting something because you grew up inside it and wanting something because you freely chose it are not the same thing, and I think Eli never had enough distance from this dream to know which one was true for him. When a family friend asked him months before departure whether he was excited, he said he was going to try his best. A kid who had genuinely chosen this would have said something different. His highest previous altitude was 13,800 feet, a hike in the Colorado Rockies the summer before. Hold that number. It is going to matter more than almost anything else in this story. They hired an experienced guiding team with a strong Everest record. Their lead Sherpa had 11 summits and 19 years working the mountain across multiple routes and seasons. This was not a reckless operation on the surface. Full acclimatization schedule, proper gear, adequate oxygen loadouts for a standard summit push. The Fenwicks had done the work. They had followed the process. And that is genuinely what makes this hard to sit with, because the scaffolding all looked right. The scaffolding was not the problem. Before I go further, I need you to understand what Everest actually does to a human body. Because altitude sickness is not a headache and some nausea. Above 26,000 feet, what climbers call the death zone, your body is not adjusting. It is dying. Slowly, systematically, in a specific order. The oxygen partial pressure at that elevation is roughly 1/3 of sea level, well below what cells need to function normally. And the way it takes you apart is not dramatic at first. That is the whole problem. It starts with judgment, then spatial reasoning, then motor coordination, then consciousness. You feel it as tiredness. You feel it as a headache you stopped noticing days ago. Most people do not realize their brain is failing until they try to walk a straight line and physically cannot. HACE, high altitude. Cerebral edema is fluid accumulating inside the skull, pressing against brain tissue from the inside. HAPE is fluid filling the lungs, slowly drowning you while you are still standing on a ridge. Both are survivable if descent begins immediately. Neither is survivable at 28,400 feet with no oxygen and a storm pinning you in place. Each climber on a standard South Col summit push carries enough supplemental oxygen for approximately 12 to 14 hours at a flow rate of 2 liters per minute. That number is not a guideline. It is the window. Any increase in flow rate, any spike in exertion, any equipment failure, and the window closes faster than you can calculate in the field. Here's where the story starts turning. During the acclimatization rotations, the structured up and back cycles teams run in the weeks before the summit push, Eli was consistently arriving 25 to 30 minutes behind every other climber in the group. At Camp 3, 24,500 feet, he had a headache running into its second day, and nausea bad enough that he was not finishing meals. The lead Sherpa logged both and recommended extending the rest period before the push. Dale said it was normal adjustment, and he was not entirely wrong. Those symptoms can be, but they can also be the opening stage of HACE, and that line is invisible until it is not. What I keep coming back to is that Dale was making that gamble on behalf of a 16-year-old whose body had never been above 13,800 feet. That is not a small thing to overlook. That is the whole ball game. Camp 4 is the part I find hardest to write because this is the moment, the last real decision point before everything becomes consequence. South Col, 26,000 feet, minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit, gusts near 55 miles per hour. This is where the mountain stops being a goal and starts being a fact. 2 other climbers in their group turned back that night, made the call at Camp 4 and descended. One of them told Dale directly that something felt off and he was not going. Dale acknowledged him and said nothing. The lead Sherpa then recommended a rest day, citing Eli's pace data across both rotations, the oxygen consumption numbers he had been tracking since Camp 3, and a weather system accelerating faster than the models had predicted. Dale overruled him. His reasoning was not irrational on the surface. A rest day at Camp 4 burns oxygen with no altitude gain, and the weather window does not pause for anyone. But the lead Sherpa had 11 summits behind him. He had seen this calculation go wrong before. He logged the decision, said nothing further, and prepared for departure. They left at 11:48 p.m., already 48 minutes behind the optimal window. Every minute lost on the ascent is a minute borrowed from the descent, and the descent is where people die. By the balcony at 27,600 feet, Eli was stopping every 8 to 10 steps, not resting, stopping, head down over his ice axe, waiting, before taking the next set. The lead Sherpa radioed base camp to flag the pace. Dale's response was to increase Eli's oxygen flow from 2 liters per minute to 3. It worked. Eli steadied almost immediately, his steps becoming more consistent. But that decision burned through his bottle 50% faster than planned. It solved the visible problem while quietly closing the window. At the south summit, 28,700 feet, a weather update came through. The system had accelerated, 4 hours out, possibly less. Dale calculated out loud to the lead Sherpa, 90 minutes to the summit, 2.5 hours down before it hit. The lead Sherpa said the numbers did not account for Eli's pace on the upper mountain, that the descent estimate assumed conditions that were no longer guaranteed. Dale said they were going. I'm not here to tell you Dale Fenwick was a bad father. I think he was a man who had spent 7 years building towards something and was standing close enough to touch it. I think Everest collected him for that. The Fenwick family reached the summit at 9:19 a.m. Their recommended turnaround time, based on oxygen load and pace data, was 9 a.m. They were 19 minutes past it before the first photo was taken. 19 minutes sounds like nothing. At 29,032 feet on a closing weather window, with an accelerating storm and a 16-year-old on a depleted oxygen supply, it is a completely different currency. The photos recovered from Dale's camera show him holding a small Oregon state flag, Lena beside him with her arm around Eli, all 3 of them looking directly into the lens. Eli is smiling, a real smile, not a grimace, not performance. The sky behind them is deep and clear. They look like a family that just did something extraordinary together. I have spent longer looking at that image than I would like to admit, because they look completely fine. They look like they made it. The weather system that would kill them was already less than 4 hours out, and none of that is visible anywhere in their face. Descent begins at 9:41 a.m. and goes wrong almost immediately. Coming down is technically harder than going up. Your crampons have to engage precisely on each downward step, and your brain has to be functional enough to direct that in real time. At 28,800 feet with depleted oxygen, Eli's brain is no longer working clearly. At the Hillary Step, a near vertical rock and ice feature at 28,839 feet, roughly 40 feet of mixed ground that requires precise footwork and a functioning head. Eli freezes. He stands at the top, looks at the exposure below, and stops moving. What follows is 23 minutes of Dale and Lena working him down that face, talking him through each foothold, physically guiding his crampon placements. Lena moving below him at one point to direct his feet onto the holds with her hands. A section a competent climber moves through in 4 minutes took them nearly half an hour. I keep thinking about Lena in that moment. Specifically, a woman who had been climbing since her mid-20s, who knew exactly what 23 minutes at that altitude cost, who understood the math better than she let on, guiding her son's feet onto the holds one by one and saying nothing about what she knew. The storm arrives at 10:53 a.m., 1 hour and 12 minutes after they left the summit. Visibility drops below 20 feet in under 5 minutes. Wind climbs past 70 miles per hour. Temperature falls sharply. The fixed lines, the anchored ropes that serve as the only reliable navigation reference in a whiteout on the upper mountain, become functionally invisible within arm's reach. The lead Sherpa, who had moved ahead on the route to prepare a lower rope section, loses both visual and radio contact with the family simultaneously. Extreme cold at that altitude routinely kills battery function and disrupts radio transmission. In those conditions, silence on the line means the storm has taken over. He turns back and attempts to push upward toward their last known position. The wind physically stops him at approximately 27,400 feet, forces him into a crouch, unable to move forward without serious risk of being swept from the ridge. He radios down. The response team at base camp initiates emergency protocol. If this story has you locked in, and I think it does, hit subscribe, because what happened in the next hour on that ridge is the part that kept me up. At 11:18 a.m., Lena's oxygen runs out. Not low, out. Investigators later determined her regulator had been experiencing a slow internal valve leak, almost certainly since Camp 4. Entirely invisible on the external pressure gauge, she had been receiving measurably less oxygen than the gauge indicated for the entire summit push and descent. The failure mode is documented in technical literature on high-altitude regulator equipment. Internal valve degradation that produces no external indicator until pressure drops to zero. At 28,400 feet with zero supplemental oxygen and an already compromised system, haste accelerates rapidly. Cognitive function begins deteriorating within 20 to 30 minutes. The fluid building inside her skull had likely been accumulating since the upper mountain. Now, with nothing slowing it, it would finish what it started. And here is where Dale does the thing that tells you everything about who he was. Even as I write this, knowing it was the last real decision he ever made, he disconnects his own oxygen line and transfers it to Lena. At 28,400 feet, with stiffened hands and a brain already running on almost nothing, that is not a simple exchange. It is a deliberate act performed under conditions designed to make deliberate acts impossible. A person breathing ambient air at that altitude will experience severe hypoxic impairment within 15 to 20 minutes and lose the ability to move purposefully within the hour. I do not know whether he fully understood what it meant for himself in that moment. I think he probably did. I think he did it anyway because she was his wife and he had brought her up there, and he was not going to stop trying to fix it. What I find hardest about that decision is not that he made it. It is that it did not save her. The HACE was already too far along. He gave away the last thing keeping him alive, and it was not enough. And somewhere underneath the hypoxia, in whatever was left of his judgment by then, he would have known that too. At approximately 12:07 p.m., a two-person climbing team descending from the summit makes visual contact with the Fenwicks near the South Summit Rock Band. This is the last confirmed sighting of all three of them alive. Their account described Dale seated in the snow with his back against the slope, not moving under his own effort, one arm around Lena, who was unresponsive, not reacting to sound or movement. Eli was standing roughly 8 feet away, facing them, upright, not speaking. One of the climbers described Eli holding eye contact with them for several seconds before turning back to look at his parents. That team had no spare oxygen. They were critically low themselves, operating on margins that made stopping a death sentence. They passed on the coordinates and a condition report to the response team below and continued their descent. There was nothing else they could do. I have read enough of these situations to understand that, and I still find it almost impossible to move past, that you can make eye contact with a 16-year-old boy standing next to his dying parents and keep walking because the alternative is dying beside him. Eli was not screaming. He was not reaching for them. He was just standing there, looking. And that is somehow worse. Lena almost certainly lost consciousness somewhere between 12:20 and 1 p.m. HACE at that stage, at that altitude, with no supplemental oxygen, does not reverse without immediate descent. She would have gone quiet and still. Dale without supplemental oxygen for close to 90 minutes, at 28,400 feet in wind and cold, would have been in severe hypoxic collapse, spatial disorientation, near total loss of motor function, a confusion that, from the outside, probably looked like sleep. He stayed where he was. He stayed with her. His body was recovered with one arm across Lena's. He did not move from her side. Eli started moving at some point after 12:07 p.m., alone, in a whiteout, at 28,400 feet, with no adult, no visibility, no fixed line he could locate, and no reference point in any direction. Whether he was trying to descend and find the route, or whether the hypoxia had already taken his spatial reasoning, and he was simply moving without knowing why, that cannot be confirmed. What I can tell you is that he moved a long way, and the direction he moved was not towards safety. A rescue attempt was launched from Camp 4 after radio contact had been lost for over 50 consecutive minutes. 2 Sherpas reached approximately 27,300 feet before sustained wind made further ascent impossible without anchor. They were called back. Helicopter extraction above base camp elevation was not viable under those conditions. The air too thin, the wind too high, the ceiling too low. The storm held for 31 hours. When it cleared on the morning of May the 23rd, a search team located Dale and Lena approximately 170 feet below the south summit. Together, partially buried under wind-compacted snow, Dale's arm still across Lena's body. Eli was found 390 feet further along the eastern ridge, alone, well below and east of his parents' position. The terrain between them includes an exposed section where a disoriented climber in a whiteout, unable to locate the fixed lines, could drift in entirely the wrong direction without ever realizing it. That is the most probable explanation. It is not a comforting one. All 3 bodies remain on the mountain. Dale, 44, died from hypoxic respiratory failure. Without supplemental oxygen at that altitude, the body continues working for a time, the heart and lungs pulling at air that can no longer sustain them, the brain dimming in stages until there is nothing left to dim. He gave his oxygen to Lena, working the connections with hands that could barely close at that altitude. In whatever time his own failing judgment still had left, Lena, 40, died from HACE compounded by hypoxia. The fluid that had been building inside her skull since the upper mountain kept pressing inward until her brain could no longer sustain her. By the time her bottle ran dry, it was already irreversible. Eli, 16, died alone, disoriented, no oxygen, no one left, moving across the upper eastern ridge in a whiteout on terrain that does not forgive a single misplaced step. He was 16 years old and he died on a mountain his father had dreamed about since before Eli was born. No legal proceedings followed. The guiding team confirmed the push had proceeded against the lead Sherpa's formal recommendation, and the case was closed. Dale's camera was recovered the following season when a climbing team passed the site. The memory card was intact. It was returned to a relative in Bend after nearly 5 months, passed through several sets of hands before anyone who actually knew the family saw what was on it. Summit photos, 3 people at the top of the world, clear sky, a flag, a real smile on a 16-year-old's face. 19 minutes past the point where the numbers stopped working, and none of it showing anywhere on them. A family that wanted the same thing, standing together at the top of it, already past the moment where any of it could be undone.